You passed him every day and never noticed the story folded into his hands. He wore the same plain jacket most mornings, the one with the cheap embroidered name tag that everyone avoided reading. He moved with practiced quiet through carpeted corridors and over tile that always looked cleaner after he left it. People hurried past him with coffee and headphones and urgent meetings. They saw a mop, a broom, a man whose shift ran while they made decisions. They did not see the mason jar under his bed, cloudy glass marked by fingerprints and the faint salt ring where coins had rested. They did not see the way he counted those coins like a private prayer. His name was Carlos Mandes. He saved in that jar for a plan he said out loud only when he was alone, a small restaurant with a wood-fired oven, a counter, a chalkboard menu scrawled in both Spanish and English. He imagined the sound of a lid popping and the first roll of bills folded into the jar's mouth, then tucked into a ledger, then filed into the real world. For now, he wiped tables in a downtown corporate building, the breakfast crumbs, the pencil marks on meeting room tables, a half-drunk cup left in the stairwell like evidence of hurried lives. The building smelled of paper and hand soap and the faint chemical tang of floor wax. Fluorescent lights hummed in long rows overhead, and somewhere far above the lobby elevators clicked like the heartbeat of a city that never stopped telling itself it mattered. Carlos had this rhythm memorized. He emptied trash bins, refilled coffee stations, straightened magazines, and bent low to pick up what other people left behind, a child's drawing, a lost mitten, a name tag fallen off a blazer. He knew most doors were locked. He knew which security guard would nod if he asked to use the phone. He knew where the janitorial closet kept the extra trash bags. People assumed invisibility was cheap. It wasn't. The work carved lines into his palms and calluses into his knuckles. After everyone left, he would rub his hands, tasting the faint residue of other people's days. Sometimes he would run a fingertip along the mason jar's lip and say a small private thank you to the plan that kept him steady. On the morning it changed, the lobby felt like any other Monday. A security camera blinked red in the corner, coffee percolated in a glass urn. The accounts payable kiosk, a squat touchscreen terminal used by small vendors and visitors to authorize walk-in wire transfers when corporate finance allowed same-day payments, rested on a counter near the elevators. The terminal had a faintly institutional sticker, authorizations, in person only. The building's cleaning schedule never crossed into those terminals. Carlos had been told twice to stay out of sensitive areas. The rule was printed in a thin employee manual that lined a shelf in the closet. Still, the terminal sat within sight of the break-room trash, and a spill on the counter drew his attention.
He wiped, as was his job. He usually avoided looking at screens, out of habit or respect, as if it were rude to peer into someone's business. But sometimes a screen announced more than a meeting time. This one had a countdown pulsing in a skinny red box, precise numbers marching down like a judge's clock. 000213. In larger type, the screen showed an amount that made his breath hitch. Amount to be authorized, $1 million. Below, a field read, vendor account, unverified. Two people stood beside the terminal. One was an older woman, her hair silvered, her cardigan buttoned to the throat, a paper bag at her feet filled with newspapers and a careful purse. She held a tablet, squinting as if the words on the screen had been printed in a foreign type. The other was a young man in a jacket that meant business but not certainty. His hands fluttered near the tablet, as if to steady it, or to hide something. Between them, a third figure, an agent working at the building's contracted accounts desk, watched like a referee, eyes narrowed and hands folded. He recited procedures in a voice that had been trained to sound calm. Carlos's mop was still in his hand when he realized what the countdown signified. He had seen numbers like that before in training modules, authorizations, approvals, the tempo of finance. But he had never seen $1 million waiting to be handed over at a public kiosk. He did not know every banking word, but he understood a few truths clearly. Money moving meant consequence. $1 million could lift a life or erase it. To an older person living on fixed income, to someone who had trusted a caller who said, "We're calling from your bank," a single authorization could be a doorway to ruin. He had been told repeatedly by building management, "Do not interfere with patron transactions." They had a liability clause that started in neat legal phrasing and stretched into the kind of gray you could not mop away. That clause, he knew, could be read like armor. Staff were instructed to maintain distance unless asked. Security drills, dry and courteous, had reinforced a posture of non-involvement. Carlos looked at Elena, her name he would learn later when others moved in to tell him, and felt the weight of the jar under his bed like a memory. He thought of his mother, of the way she had tightened a towel around a pan so it wouldn't spill, of the way she taught him, one person back is two forward. He thought of the jar itself, about the time he had nearly used it for rent, and then swallowed the idea like medicine. He could picture the lid, the small scrape near the rim where he once hit it against a table in a hurry and swore in soft Spanish. That scrape was a map of patience. He could have kept walking. He could have cleaned the counter, replaced the paper towels, let professional lines and policies decide. The job said no. His conscience said yes. "Excuse me," he said, soft, the mop angled like a baton.
The young man glanced at him with the kind of annoyance that passes for power in mid-level schemes. The contractor agent's posture tightened. "What can I do for you, sir?" the agent asked, voice even. "It's—" Carlos paused. He had rehearsed nothing. He looked at the older woman, who blinked like someone waking. "Ma'am, are you comfortable with this? Do you know that—" The young man stepped closer, a shadow cutting the space. "It's fine, sir. This is private." His tone had the thin varnish of someone protecting a secret. "That's rule," the agent said, a reminder and a wedge, and for a heartbeat the rules of the building settled like a board across a pond. The countdown blinked, 00108. Elena, because he could not bring himself to call her anything else, kept her hand on the tablet, not moving with the speed of a person under pressure, but with the heavy, careful motion of someone trying to remember a lifetime. Carlos thought about momentum. He thought about how often good intentions collided with posted policies, and how often the rulebook won. He thought of his mother's hand pressing a muffin tin down, the way she had taught him that small things pressed in the right direction could get hot enough to bake. He did something small and deliberate. He put his mop down in a soft arc and moved around the counter. He did not touch the tablet. He planted himself at enough distance to be helpful and not threatening. "Ma'am," he said to Elena in a voice now steadier, "if you want, I can call your bank. We can check." The young man's face tightened, and his hand, too quick, moved for the tablet. "No," he snapped. "Don't touch. This is private." "I'm not touching it," Carlos answered. "I can make a call. I can read the name on the transfer, same as you can." He lowered his voice. "Is this your money?" Elena's mouth moved, a trembling shape. "He says it's for a contractor," she said. "He said they fixed my pipes." Carlos glanced at the screen. Vendor account, unverified. The terminal allowed a walk-in authorization for same-day wiring to accounts on file, an exception the company had made years ago to accommodate small vendors and visiting contractors. That exception had not been invented yesterday. It existed for convenience. Small businesses could request payments without waiting days for corporate approval if they presented proper identification in person. It was a loophole in a massive machine of approval, and like all loopholes, it could be useful or dangerous. "Do you have the contractor's number?" Carlos asked. "The bank should have your account on file." He tried to keep the question simple. If someone had actually done work for Elena, they would have a phone number. They would accept a call that cleared their name. The young man laughed, the sound brittle. "Don't you see how these people are, always worried?" He reached again. His fingers brushed Elena's sleeve in an attempt to move the tablet. The motion was almost casual, the way people keep moving in convoys when they want you to calm down. Elena's hand twitched away. Carlos's chest tightened in a way he had not felt since he ran the night shift and watched a neighbor leave with a flat tire and no money. This was not his fight, officialdom insisted, but the jar under his bed was a map of other people's generosity and his own endurance. It was also a promise. He thought of how $1 million in a wrong place could become a household's grief. He thought of Elena's careful purse with its worn strap and the way an older person's life measured value not in numbers, but in the neat arcs of routine. The morning paper, the bus pass, the neighbor collecting mail. "Is there a card?" he asked softly. "Any name?" The agent, a man named Peter, later said, felt the weight of the space between them and reached for procedure. "Sir, this is a private transaction. If the customer asks for help, we can assist with a contact number, but we can't," he began, and then the young man's voice cut across him. "They're trying to make this public," the young man hissed, and his hand closed over the tablet like a fist closing on a decision. He moved Elena's hand. She flinched as if someone had tugged a thread loose. Carlos stepped sideways and put his hand on the small of Elena's back, not to push but to steady. "It's okay," he told her, and it was the first time a stranger had ever offered her such a word in that room. His hand was rough with work. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were lucid despite the exhaustion that lived underneath them. The watch in the terminal's corner showed 00032. Everything compressed. Carlos felt his body map into a single axis, breath, thought, action. He knew that if the authorization completed, the transfer would begin a chain he did not have keys to stop. He heard the spinner of the terminal, the soft click of a plastic chair, the distant lift of a voice talking about a meeting. His mind briefly cataloged possible consequences. Elena's bank alert would ping a phone she may not check in time, reversal processes could be slow and uncertain, and $1 million, no small number, could be rerouted to a vendor account that might already be a ghost. He told Elena he would call her bank and do it now.
He picked up a building phone on the wall by habit. The corporate phones were for internal use, and he knew the number for the building's front desk. The front desk would know a protocol to place a hotline call to the finance department. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't what training said he should do, but it was concrete. The young man woved like a shadow closing to take the phone from the wall. "You're not calling anyone," he said, and the sentence came out more like a command than a request. Carlos braced. He felt the first hard pressure against his ribs, brief, sharp, when the man shoved him back.
It wasn't a cinematic blow. It was an effort to assert control. Carlos staggered, grabbed the counter to steady himself, and the pain bloomed like an unwelcome confirmation, ribs bruised, breath short. He smelled of bleach and pennies and felt blood warm and ordinary under his skin. Someone in the lobby, no longer invisible, lifted a phone. A woman near the vending machine, a municipal worker on her lunch break, had been watching. She raised her phone and began to film. The recording started as all recordings do, a tilted, insistent frame, the screen filling with the terminal's countdown, and Carlos's hand holding the tablet against the young man's grasp. A soft murmur rose. "Hey," someone said. "Hey, can you?" Then more people gathered, drawn by the algebra of human curiosity. They did not come to be heroes. They came because when pieces of daily life rearrange themselves into a visible problem, those nearby tend to pause. The young man struggled to cover the screen. He tried to snatch the authorization slip from Alina's grip. Carlos reached out, and with a motion that surprised him in its decisiveness, slid a hand between the paper and the man's reach. His fingers closed on the authorization slip and held it. He did not rip it away or crush it. He simply held it until officers arrived. "Give it back," the young man hissed. His face was a mask of fear and business. "No," Carlos said, the words small and simple. He did not call the agent or anyone by name. He called to the people around him. "Someone, please, call the police." The agent, who had been trained to de-escalate, found his voice again and used it as a tool, not a weapon. "Security, we need security here," he said. He reached for a wall-mounted emergency button, a small square of plastic. Someone else had already called. The line between procedure and urgency blurred into a chorus of clicks and dials. The young man shoved once more. This time the shove hit not just the ribs, but the center of the room's attention. The woman with the phone kept filming, thumbs steady. The clip would later be described as simple, unadorned footage of a janitor holding a slip of paper and refusing to let a transaction proceed. In the rawness of that moment, the camera captured a bruise beginning to swirl like the first bruise of late summer, a tender halo under Carlos' shirt. A security guard arrived in a slow, measured way, as if summoned by the building's careful gears. He separated the men, asked for identification, asked a litany of neutral questions. The police, when they came, moved with their own type of decisiveness. They were patient in the way professionals are when they have been trained to document rather than to adjudicate. They detained the young man. Names and charges would be handled later by officers and detectives. For now, the night blurred into a loop of statements and the rustle of paper, witness reports, contact cards, the kind of paperwork that makes ordinary moments official. Carlos clutched the authorization slip until an officer took it from him. He described the shove, the pressure at his ribs. He said he had intervened to help an older woman. His voice trembled at times, not from fear, but from the rawness of the rib pain. He offered his name. They wrote it down. They asked him to wait for a formal statement. He sat on a plastic chair and felt the fabric bruise against his back. Elena, her face pale but steady, told them she did not remember fully signing anything and that she had felt confused by the conversation she was having with a man who claimed to be a contractor. Policy followed. The building's management sent a short, neutral message that would later be quoted in headlines. The company could not comment on an ongoing investigation. Human Resources issued a form letter. Staff involvement in security incidents required review. Carlos was asked to step aside. He was told he might face disciplinary action for interfering with a customer's private transaction. The phrasing was polite, but it felt to him like a cold hand trying to close a door. He felt suddenly very small. The bruise on his ribs throbbed like an honest thing. He thought of the mason jar beneath his mattress, its lid tight with coins counted toward a dream. He thought, quietly, that maybe the jar had done more than hold money. It had gathered the muscle memory of choosing a life. It had taught him that keeping a promise to someone else, anyone else, sometimes means risking the small things you have. A clip of the confrontation, filmed on a shaky phone and posted by a bystander, moved through the quiet parts of the internet with a strange, slow hunger. It showed exactly enough to create a story. An older woman, the tablet, a man reaching, a janitor stepping in and being pushed. The caption read, in the language of social outrage and hope, "Janitor stops $1 million fraud." It did not settle into finality. It woke people up. Word moved faster than the building's press release. Messages blinked on phones. People tagged friends. Someone wrote a short note. "Where do we send support?" Another user left a comment. "This is the kind of bravery we ignore." The footage became the kind of small viral thing that asks a city to decide what it saw.
Carlos sat in a small room provided by management while officers took statements. The room smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. He kept his back straight and breathed shallowly. A nurse on the scene pressed ice to the forming bruise and asked about pain. He told her he'd be fine. He had work to do. He had a shift later in the week at the building, though management had told him, in the calm language of assessments, that he should expect a suspension pending review. The nurse wrote down his information with a sympathetic tilt of the head and left him a bandage. Outside, someone had started a crowdfunding page with good intentions and a sober note asking for help with medical bills and lost wages.
A local organizer posted a link asking for donations for an elder safety fund. People messaged Elena's family, or what they thought might be her family. They called the building and left messages. They asked officials to look into terminal security. A neighbor from the apartment below Carlos texted him a photo of the posted clip and a brace of encouraging words and a promise to bring soup. The building's management, pressured by the clip's circulation, walked a careful line. They emphasized safety protocols and the need to review staff actions. The corporate voice sounded polished. We appreciate the swift response of our security and local law enforcement teams. It was the language of distance, of corporate bodies designed to diffuse heat. It had no mason jar, no bruise, no ribs. But something else moved at the edges, a quiet committee of people who had always noticed the invisible. A retired chef who knew Carlos by name saw the clip and remembered the way Carlos had once fixed a leaking oven gasket at a food truck where he used to work. He reached out, offering mentorship. A woman who ran a local elder services nonprofit called a colleague and asked about hosting workshops at the lobby for elders and building staff. A community organizer with a reputation for showing up posted a message offering to coordinate rides, meals, and a legal aid referral list for anyone affected. 3 simple pieces of advice circulated in those first days, credited to a bank representative and a community advisor who joined a televised community conversation. If someone asks you to authorize a large transfer, call the bank back on a number you already have. Never authorize a transaction under pressure. And take time, walk away if you can, before you sign anything. The phrasing was plain and practical. The advice fit neatly into people's pockets like small, helpful objects. Carrying the bruise after he left the building, Carlos walked back to his room over the laundromat. He moved slowly, feeling each step. The laundromat's hum was a softer anthem than the building's fluorescent buzz. Coins clinked in a metal tray where someone else had dropped change. He climbed the narrow stairs past a neighbor airing a shirt and thought about how odd it was that visibility arrived at him with an ache. He thought about how being noticed felt like being measured. He locked his door and pulled the mason jar from under the bed. The coins rattled like an offering. He stared at the lid for a long moment and then did an odd small thing. He tightened it and placed the jar on the table near his phone. He wanted it near, where he could see the way it gathered light. The jar was not a trophy. It was a ledger of everyday persistence. The clip continued to move outward. Someone from a neighborhood talk show reached out for a brief interview. A local food vendor offered to put his name on a list for a small commercial lease that had come available. Messages of support were sometimes awkward, sometimes heartfelt, often both. Offers arrived. A volunteer with a van could help him pick up supplies. A retired nurse wanted to contribute to a fund for his medical bills. Crowdfunding donations, small, precise, human, arrived like a series of tiny hands placing coins on a table. And yet, management's initial move was formal. Carlos received an email at home, the kind that begins with appreciation and concludes with procedures. It informed him of a temporary suspension while the building's incident review was conducted. "This is standard," it read in neutral type. Carlos printed the email and folded it into his pocket. It weighed nothing, except for the feeling it left behind, the sensation of an invisible rulebook tightening. He understood the logic. Buildings protected themselves. Policies existed because many people had learned the hard lesson of liability. But he also recognized another kind of logic, a moral arithmetic, in which a moment of intervention could not be reduced to a line item. He had held the paper. He had felt the breath of someone else's life in his hands, and the decision to act had been small and enormous at once. At night, the bruise softened into a dark petal against his ribs. He lay awake and counted the moments like coins. He replayed the scene without the crowd, stripping it down to decisions and gestures, the mop, the tilt of a head, the slide of a hand that took a paper from an anxious man. He did not think of fame. He knew people would make the clip into an emblem if they wanted. He did not care for emblems. What he cared about was the way a woman with soft hands still talked about the contractor with a voice like a story stuck in throat. He wanted her to be safe and whole. The next morning, the building's lobby had a different quality. Security procedures tightened.
The terminal received a polite, hurried-looking notice that in-person authorizations would be paused pending a review. A small sign appeared beside the kiosk advising customers to contact their banking institutions directly. Staffers who passed Carlos in the hallway offered him awkward smiles, the kind that tried to be brave and apologetic in one breath. Some avoided him. Humans, when faced with social pressure, often err toward preserving themselves. But others sought him out. The retired chef knocked on the door of the room above the laundromat one afternoon with a battered notebook and a proposal for a pop-up evening market. He proposed teaching Carlos how to price dishes so they did not devour their profits. He wanted to connect him with a supplier who could offer produce at wholesale rates, and a kitchen that would trade rent for help cleaning. The offer was practical and tender, the kind of help that doesn't arrive wrapped in press releases. Elena, who had been coaxed into hospital observation for a precautionary bout of stress, sent a letter later that week. It was not a letter of grand declarations.
It was a page of careful handwriting and a small, shaky gracias at the end. She spoke of confusion and of a man who had steadied her hand. She wrote that she slept more after someone explained the next steps, and that someone from a neighborhood center had come by to show her how to check account alerts on her phone. The letter arrived folded once and smelled faintly of jasmine soap. The footage that had started the ripple never captured the slow, complicated aftermath. It omitted the way management spoke in cautious corporate echoes. It omitted the small kindnesses, the offers of mentorship, the retired chef's careful notes. The clip was simple. Reality is rarely so tidy. In the days that followed, the city murmured. Someone organized a small donation drive, careful to include guidance on verified accounts and transparent stewardship. A local council member called for clearer protocols for in-person authorizations at public terminals. Vendors and contractors who used the kiosk wanted clarity too. Some had legitimate claims and feared being tarred by an act of fraud. The conversation became larger than a single shove among three people. It grew into the question of how a city sustains care without making invisible hands bear the entire weight. Carlos kept returning to work when he could, though his shifts were subject to review. He walked through the lobby that many had filmed and now many more watched. Some faces softened, others kept looking away. He mopped a strip in front of the elevators and counted his motions like a metronome. He practiced quietness with the precision of someone rehearsing a new identity. Janitor, steward, possible restaurateur. He did not speak often about his plans for the restaurant to reporters who offered soft, hungry questions. He felt protective of the jar and of its slow building. He wanted the restaurant to be a real thing. Kitchen license, insurance, schedule, no smoke and bright headlines. He wanted community, not spectacle. Still, offers arrived. A supplier offered a discounted first shipment of flour. A neighbor with a small storefront suggested that Carlos test a menu there for an evening. Each offer was a small opening and a test of whether care could be translated into practice without being co-opted by optics. Meanwhile, the bruise on his ribs faded into a pale memory. Every now and then, when he bent to wipe a spill or to pick up a stray napkin, he would feel the ache and remember the choice with the warmth of a burn. The jar remained under the bed, its weight familiar. He slept, sometimes, after thinking through the math of the business plan, and sometimes after reading the letter from Elena that smelled like soap. Something else began to take shape like a map traced by many hands. A community workshop on elder safety, organized by a nonprofit and hosted in the building's ground floor community room. They invited a generic bank representative, not named in press releases, a spokesperson for consumer education, and a community advisor who ran workshops for older adults. They kept the advice plain and practical. Call a known number, don't sign under pressure, and take time. The advice was not a cure, but it was a tool set. It turned the image of protection into a skill people could learn. As the workshop date approached, the clip's momentum fed a broader debate about who notices invisible labor and who bears the consequences. People wrote opinion pieces. Some praised the janitor, some cautioned about the messy ethics of citizen intervention. The argument was the kind that cities have when they try to translate compassion into policy. Carlos watched less of the commentary and more of the small people moving in local ways. The woman who made soup for the office cleaners, the retired chef drafting a supply list, the organizer who kept the donation page transparent and accountable. He began to understand that visibility could be messy and uneven, that it could bring both heat and help. He did not like the idea of being a banner. He liked the idea of a steady table with a place for everyone. One morning, a neighbor knocked and handed him an envelope.
Inside was a small list of dates and an offer from a community college for a food safety course at a reduced rate. "They say you're good," the neighbor said, folding the paper into his palm. Carlos smiled, the kind of small smile that belonged to someone mid-count. He slipped the paper into a pocket and looked at the mason jar where it rested on his kitchen table. The jar blinked back like something that had kept faith with him. He imagined a future night when the restaurant would have a small sign and a counter, and old chairs where Elena might join for a bowl of soup. For tonight, he walked to the bus stop and felt the city's humid breath. The bruise on his ribs ached when he stepped too quickly. Above him, the lights of the building shone steady, an indifferent constellation. Later, he would learn that the company's review of terminal protocols would not be as swift as some hoped. He would also learn that the small, practical offers, healthcare payments from a neighborhood fund, mentoring from a chef, a chance to test menu items, were the sort of gifts that build slowly and insistently. For now, he carried the attention like a glass of water, careful, aware that it could spill. On the sidewalk, a woman stopped him. She had been the one who filmed. She did not offer him the camera. Instead, she pressed a note into his hand. It read simply, "Thank you." The note was not enough to explain the tidal thing that had begun, but it was human and true. He folded the note and placed it in the jar, a soft thing among coins. The jar felt heavier. He closed the lid and walked home under the same hum of fluorescent memory and the softer sputter of streetlight.
He walked with his ribs plainly under his jacket, with both the bruise and the recognition stitched together like two small badges. A week later, the clip would have thousands of views and a press person knocking at management's door. Offers would swell from surprising places, but those were things for another time. At the moment when the door shut behind him and the jar sat like a steady heart on his kitchen table, Carlos felt something he had not expected. Not fame, not even gratitude, but the kind of attention that makes responsibilities heavier and clearer. He had acted not because he wanted to be seen, but because he had to choose between staying small and keeping someone else whole. He turned off the light and let the room sink into the quiet. The jar, the bruise, the tired hands were all proof. The world is held together by people who do not expect applause. The next morning he would mop, refill the coffee urn, and walk the same path through the lobby. People would pass. Some would not. Some would not. The mason jar would remain under his bed, and he would continue to count coins like a promise. He had no wish to be a hero in bright lights. He wanted a safe city and a small place to feed people. When he slept, he dreamed of a chalkboard menu and of Elena's steady smile. He dreamed of hands passing a plate and of people who once were unnoticed learning to tell their stories aloud. He did not dream of headlines. He dreamt of work that warmed. Outside, the city moved, and the clip, the single sharp moment of a shove and a slip of paper, kept making its rounds. It demanded answers. It demanded that people look at what they had allowed to be invisible for so long. The response would be complicated, and it would require more than a single man's actions. But the conversation had begun, and Carlos's hand, knuckle-scraped and careful, had been one of the small forces that nudged it into motion. The clip kept moving. It spread in frames, a shaky phone held too steady, a bruise beginning to bloom under a collar, a janitor's hand holding the slip of paper like an anchor. It moved through group chats and neighborhood pages, and quiet corners of the internet where people chose to pay attention. People who had never thought about the accounts payable kiosk now forwarded the clip with captions that read like small confessions. "We didn't see him," or "This is the kind of courage our streets need." Others watched and argued about rules and liability, about whether bystanders should intervene, and who should be responsible when a machine makes $1 million look like a button. Within hours, local reporters came by the building. They were gentle at first, offering time and a list of questions. A morning show wanted a brief interview. A neighborhood podcast host rang his doorbell.
Offers arrived in different shapes. A retired chef offering to test recipes in a shared kitchen. An organizer with a list of pro bono lawyers asking if he needed help navigating the suspension paperwork. A neighbor with a van saying she would drive him to appointments. Someone left a stack of paper towels and a thermos on the stoop with a note, "For your shifts. Thank you." Not everything that arrived was helpful. There were well-intentioned people who spoke loudly about heroism, as if a man who had simply done what he felt he had to do were an emblem to be polished. Carlos deflected that attention. He refused an offer to be photographed sitting beneath a banner. He said no to plans that felt like spectacles. He wanted the mason jar to remain a private thing, a quiet ledger of work and hope, not a prop in someone else's narrative. Early on, a soft CTA went up on a community page. If this story moves you, tell us where you're watching from and tag an invisible worker who deserves a thank you. It was small and human. It gathered comments, names of nurses, night shift custodians, grocery clerks, people who had never expected applause and did not always want it, but who appreciated being recognized. The crowdfunding page that appeared was careful about transparency. A neighbor with nonprofit experience set it up and left a simple note of accountability. Funds would first cover medical bills and lost wages, with any remainder placed into a publicly audited neighborhood account to support elder safety workshops. People sent in modest sums, a few dollars from a commuter who watched the clip on a subway, $50 from a small business owner across town, a $100 donation from a retired teacher who wrote, "Use it to get your ribs patched and to keep cooking." The donations were not a guarantee of anything grand. They were practical hands, enough to pay for a doctor's visit, to keep him afloat for a few weeks' wages, to buy a small bag of flour that would one day become a loaf. Management's initial reaction remained bureaucratic and careful. The suspension notice was real and routine-looking, the kind of language that tried to be neutral and procedural. Pending review meant uncertainty. But the clip forced a public conversation. A council member asked a local regulator about policies for walk-in authorizations at public-facing terminals. The building's management, sensitive to reputational pressure, announced a temporary pause of in-person authorizations and an internal review. It was not an apology. It was not a promise. It was a procedural update dressed as prudence. The alleged fraudster who had been detained at the scene was processed in the way city systems work: statements taken, identification checked, facts to be reviewed. The police made clear that the case would be subject to further investigation. There were no courtroom finales on the timeline anyone could report with certainty.
Journalists who wanted drama were told, gently but firmly, that legal outcomes were not yet settled. For Carlos, the more immediate matters were practical. The bruise throbbed. He had to see a physician to check for a cracked rib. He had to provide a formal statement to law enforcement. He had to wait on a corporate incident review that might decide his employment status. He had to get back to the small math of living: bus fare, rent, the jar. The neighbor-led fundraising paid for the doctor's visit and a week of missed wages. A retired nurse from the neighborhood clinic offered to see him pro bono for follow-up care. The bandage on his ribs sat like a talisman of the night he had decided not to walk away. He paid the nurse in coffee and conversation, in recipes and gratitude. She insisted she was repaid by the fact that the city now had one fewer vulnerable person at risk. Mentorship arrived in practical texts. The retired chef who had knocked on his door began texting a schedule. "Meet me Wednesday at 6. We'll talk menu." The chef, Luis, was insistently practical. He spoke about margins and suppliers and how to scale a dish. He offered a small kitchen afternoon where Carlos could test a single recipe on a charity night. He introduced Carlos to a produce supplier who would sell leftover crates at cost. He coached him on food safety certification processes and directed him to the community college list where Carlos found a discounted food handling class. Carlos paid a few dollars and went, notebook in hand, elbows still tender. The jar stayed under his bed, but it changed shape in his mind. It was no longer only a store of coins toward a dream. It had become a place where notes could rest, small pieces of gratitude, a neighbor's receipt for a bandage, the list of dates for the food safety course. He added to it with the same slow care he always had: a few coins from a shift, a few dollars from a friend who wanted to help, a small donation from someone who had watched the clip and felt called to contribute. The community's response went beyond money. Neighbors coordinated rides, volunteers brought home-cooked meals, and a local nonprofit for elder services started an outreach program in the building. They organized a workshop, neutral, educational, and practical, on recognizing scams and safeguarding financial information. The workshop was not flashy. It took place in a ground-floor room with stackable chairs and a coffee urn. A generic bank representative, a consumer education officer who did not represent any single institution in the headlines, spoke in plain language. A community advisor shared a simple checklist that could be printed and carried in a wallet. Those 3 tips were repeated in the workshops and on leaflets around the lobby. Call a phone number you already have on your account documents, not the one given by a caller. Never authorize a transfer under pressure, and take time. Walk away, consult someone you trust, verify.
The advice was blunt and practical. It fit into people's pockets the way a small flashlight fits into a glove compartment. It did not solve every scam, but it gave elders and caregivers a set of steps that could prevent the worst outcomes. Elena recovered. She spoke with a counselor who helped her untangle what had happened. She signed papers that allowed community volunteers to help her set up account alerts on her phone and to identify trusted contacts who could confirm transactions. When someone offered to analyze her bank statements, she said no. She wanted to understand things on her own terms.
She met with the community organizer once, twice, and then again over soup. Her gratitude to Carlos came in small, human ways: a handwritten note, cookies baked in a chipped pan, an invitation to sit for a bowl of caldo when the new restaurant finally had a bench and steam. The building's review process moved slowly. It was guided by policy managers who had never expected to make decisions under public pressure. They examined training modules, liability clauses, and past exceptions that allowed walk-in authorizations. The review produced a list of proposed changes: clearer signage near terminals, a temporary hold on in-person walk-in authorizations for amounts above a certain threshold, increased staff training on how to identify potential coercion, and a policy to immediately involve supervisors or security when someone looks uncertain. The changes were small and incremental, procedural measures that might prevent a near-term repeat, but would not address broader economic vulnerabilities. Carlos read the memo that announced the changes and felt a mix of relief and ambivalence. The memo acknowledged the incident and said the company was reviewing training and protocols. It did not say he would be reinstated. It did say that management recognized the need to support customers. He was told he would be paid for the day of the incident and that his suspension was under review. There was gratitude in the language, but it was couched in the careful syntax of corporate risk management. Public attention, however, shifted the tone. Local columnists wrote about the dignity of work and the way cities were held together by hands that rarely made headlines. On a Sunday morning, a community radio program hosted a call-in where listeners told stories of custodians who had quietly helped them over the years. The retired chef, appearing on a neighbor podcast, spoke not of heroism but of craft, how working in kitchens taught respect for the labor that keeps communal spaces functional. Carlos began to test dishes at a pop-up market that the retired chef had organized. He cooked one evening and served the small line of people who had been watching the clip for signs of spectacle. Instead, they found a man who moved steadily and who had learned to balance heat and time. He served tamales and a simple stew, and people lined up not to see the story but to taste the food.
The pop-up paid him a small fee. More importantly, it taught him the rhythms of a kitchen, how to manage a line, the exact point at which salsa was seasoned enough, how to price small menus so they covered costs without losing guidance. Offers of help were often practical and specific. A landlord with a small empty storefront in a nearby block offered a short-term reduced rent if Carlos could keep the space for a weekend market trial. A supplier offered his first bag of flour at cost. A neighbor who taught bookkeeping at night offered to help him draft a simple ledger. These were not magic. They were the sturdy scaffolding of a small, sustained plan. Meanwhile, the crowdfunding funds were allocated with care. The neighbor who had started the page published a weekly ledger for donors to see: medical bills paid, a week of wages replaced, small reimbursements for bus fare and food safety course fees. Any leftover funds after these expenses were placed into a verified community fund to underwrite elder safety education. The transparency calmed some critics who had worried the campaign would be mismanaged. It did not stop skeptics from arguing that crowdfunding was an inadequate substitute for systemic protection, but it did help Carlos cover immediate needs and kept the narrative focused on concrete help rather than abstract praise. When the building announced that Carlos would be reinstated to his position pending a full review, there was no marching band. There was a careful email and a small meeting where HR asked him questions about policies and offered him a referral to an employee assistance program. The reinstatement was framed as a matter of internal process, a typical HR outcome meant to balance employee rights and policy. For Carlos, it felt like a small restoration. It meant wages would resume and that the jar could be filled without the anxiety of a disappearing pay stub. It meant he could go back to the predictable small chores: buffing floors, replacing bags, folding napkins. Reinstatement, however, did not erase the bruise beneath his shirt. It sat like a private ledger of cost. He had chosen to act and had paid a price. He had also been buoyed by neighbors and strangers who turned a short clip into a pattern of care. He took both facts into his life with the same steady hands that wiped counters. The ledger in the jar continued. As months moved forward, the restaurant idea took shape in small, bureaucratic steps. Carlos completed the food safety course. He practiced a closed menu: 2 soups, 3 small plates, a weekly special. He met with the retired chef for a late-night planning session about profit margins and inventory. He learned to balance the cost of avocados and cilantro against the price of a single good tortilla. He applied for a small license, queued for a health inspection at the city office, and bartered for discounts with a supplier who said he admired the way Carlos had defended an older woman.
Opening day was small. It was a weekday morning. The space smelled of coffee and clean wood. The sign was simple and hand-painted by a neighbor who volunteered to help. Elena came and sat at a table by the window, wearing the cardigan she had worn that morning at the terminal, now pressed and clean. She held a cup of caldo and said, plainly, "Gracias." There were a few members of the community: the retired chef, the neighbor with the van,
someone from the nonprofit who had helped set up workshops. They ate and praised the food, not because it was perfect, but because it fit the quiet shape of what they had been doing together, turning attention into something sustainable and visible. Carlos kept the mason jar behind the counter in the restaurant for a while. People would put coins in it and drop a note. Sometimes they left small notes of thanks, sometimes suggestions for a new menu item. The jar was neither an altar nor a trophy. It was a living object that continued to collect modest means and modest hopes. He did not like to be photographed with it. He preferred to keep the labor behind the counter, animated by quiet competence. The building did make some procedural changes. The kiosk's owner, an external contractor, announced a review of user interface design and suggested adding a confirmation protocol for large transfers that required a verified phone call to a number on file. The policy was not a panacea. It was a layer of friction intended to make it harder for coercion to succeed. Critics said the change might inconvenience legitimate vendors. Supporters said it at least made predatory tactics harder. The truth sat in the middle, messy and incremental. The elder safety workshops continued. They became recurring events in the building and in other neighborhood lobby spaces. Volunteers set up a table and handed out clear, simple prints explaining the 3 steps. Call the number you already have on your account. Never authorize under pressure, and take time to check. Volunteers taught elders how to set up account alerts and how to identify common red flags: a caller asking for immediate authorization, an unknown account number, a person pressuring for haste. They did not promise immunity from scams. They promised practical steps that could reduce risk. Carlos kept translating attention into craft. He tested menus and adjusted prices. He returned to his shifts with a new tilt to his shoulders, not heavier, but more aware that people had looked and that their noticing had consequences. People who had passed him now sometimes nodded. A few waved. A building manager offered him a small certificate recognizing his civic-minded intervention, but Carlos accepted it awkwardly and slid it into a drawer. He preferred the quiet of a properly made sopa to a framed commendation. Months later, the neighborhood held a modest community meal hosted at the restaurant.
It was a monthly table where elders could come and share a warm bowl, and where volunteers from the Elder Service nonprofit could answer questions about scams. Elena came with 2 friends and sat at the table like someone who had never expected to be paid special attention and had decided she liked it. The meal was paid for by a community fund, seeded in part by leftover crowdfunding money. It was not a gala. It was a practical way to keep the community connected and to make sure the advice given in workshops remained in circulation. Reporters revisited the story sometimes. They liked the arc: the shove, the clip, the suspension, the crowdfunding, the small business opening. They asked whether the public attention had the right shape, whether crowdsourced accountability was a good substitute for systemic protections. Carlos answered, as he always had, that he had acted because a person needed help and because he had been raised to believe one person back is 2 forward. He did not make claims about changing the world. He described what had happened: a painful push, a bruised rib, a few days without pay, a jar under a bed. He told them about the retiree who taught him to price food, about the neighbor who ran the donation ledger, about the woman who filmed and later sat in his restaurant eating a bowl of soup. There were quiet recognitions that mattered more than any headline. The retired chef helped him negotiate a small supplier deal. A community college waived the cost of a culinary test. A neighbor offered to loan him a crate of plates. These were the infrastructure of a small life being built in public. The jar was still there beneath his bed, but the counter now held receipts and a small ledger. He kept the bruise as a memory and a warning. It surfaced sometimes when he laughed too hard or when he turned too quickly. It reminded him that action had friction and consequence. He used that memory to teach volunteers at the elder safety workshops how to be courageous without becoming reckless. Call the police, he would tell a volunteer, but also call the bank. Tell people to take time. He stressed that intervention was best when it did not become just reaction, when it connected a person in immediate danger to systems that could help. The community's efforts began to seed modest structural changes elsewhere. Another building in the neighborhood paused its own in-person authorization process. A small coalition produced a short guide that neighborhood associations could use to train front desk staff and to recognize when someone might be under pressure. It was not policy at the state level. It did not fix financial predation, but it shifted practice in the places where people might otherwise have continued to stand by.
As the restaurant settled into a rhythm, Carlos added a monthly soup and stories night, an hour where elders could come and share a meal for free, and where volunteers offered short talks on phone scams and how to set up alerts. Elena became a regular. She liked a corner table, a cup of tea, and occasionally helped hand out napkins. She never called herself a survivor in public. She called herself someone who had been helped, and she liked to bring a small batch of cookies to the kitchen on slow afternoons. Public attention dimmed in some ways. The clip that had moved through feeds became a part of a past. News stories took its place. But the daily practices that followed kept their shape. The kiosk had a new sign. The building posted information for elders at the reception desk. The restaurant kept a small jar and a ledger and a humble menu. The retired chef continued to offer counsel. The neighbor who had started the crowdfunding page still checked the account and posted periodic updates to donors. Carlos continued to count coins. He also learned to reconcile ledgers and to talk about food costs without flinching. He learned to accept help without feeling indebted in a bad way. He accepted gratitude as a currency that could be exchanged into practical steps, mentorship that became knowledge, a supplier who became an ally, a neighbor who drove him to a health appointment. These were not grand prizes. They were the real things that feed livelihoods. One evening, months after the incident, when the restaurant closed and the last dishwasher hummed, Carlos sat with the mason jar on a clean counter and read a small note someone had slipped inside. "Thank you for keeping us safe." He pressed the jar's lid closed and felt the weight of it. He had not wanted to be the center of anything. He had wanted to keep someone whole. The city learned in small increments to notice what it had been missing. Buildings revised procedures. Neighborhood groups kept workshops going. Volunteers taught elders to use simple safeguards. The man who had shoved him had become a case file rather than a headline. The legal process continued at its own pace, sometimes separate from public feeling, and certainly outside the comfort of instant judgment. The structural problems that allowed scams to happen stayed stubbornly large. The changes, policy patches, workshops, a small restaurant, were not cures. They were patches and practices that made a semblance of safety more available in one neighborhood. On quiet mornings, as he swept a floor that smelled of coffee and warm bread, Carlos kept his hands steady. People passed with more awareness now. Some stopped to ask about the soup of the day. Some nodded silently. Some carried their own jars, metaphorical or literal, of small acts and promises. The city still moved in its usual rhythms of urgency and indifference, but along one block, attention had tightened into a small web of mutual aid.
At closing, when the lights dimmed and the last customer left the table, Carlos would sometimes take the jar to the back and add a few coins. He would slide a note into it sometimes, a receipt for flour, a list of vendor numbers, a phone number for the nonprofit's elder advice line. He kept the jar in the same place, but reservedly. It was not meant to be a showcase. It was a living ledger of what people could do when they noticed each other. The story did not end with a single triumph. It continued in increments. An elder who learned to check her alerts, a contractor who made his invoices transparent, a building that added signage, a man who opened a small restaurant where a community could meet. The bruise faded, but left a thin map of memory. The jar grew and shifted purpose. The incident had started as an ordinary shift, with the extraordinary choice to not look away. That choice had rippled outward in ways both messy and kind. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from, and if you can, tag an invisible worker you appreciate, someone who keeps your morning steady and your spaces clean. The smallest acknowledgments travel farther than we think. When people asked Carlos about bravery, he would say simply that he had done the practical thing available to him. He had called, he had held a paper in his hand, he had asked for help. He favored verbs over labels. He told volunteers at the workshop that courage often looks like a hand holding a slip of paper until help arrives, not like a movie hero making grand gestures. On the street, the lights of the building still hummed. The accounts payable kiosk had a new notice and a small taped leaflet about account security. The restaurant sign glowed modestly in the dusk. Elena waved from a corner table where she had come with a friend to celebrate a neighbor's birthday. The mason jar, once a private thing tucked beneath a bed, now sat quietly at the back of the restaurant, full of small coins and small notes, and the memory of a night when someone decided not to turn away. The city kept turning. Some systems remained opaque. Scams continued in other corners. But one small ledger, coins and notes, and a tiny, stubborn insistence that attention mattered, kept being updated. It would not solve everything,
but it helped build practices and relationships that made certain kinds of harm harder to commit. At the end of a long day, when the mop was rinsed and the mop bucket drained, and the last cup had been stacked, Carlos would put the jar back in its place and close the restaurant door behind him. He would feel the ache in his ribs like a thin line of memory. He would feel the warmth of a community meal and the hum of people who had chosen to act. He had not brought consequences, both difficult and tender.
He kept doing the work because it mattered in the most ordinary sense. It fed people, it kept a neighborhood safe, and it taught others how to look. If you want to help in a practical way, look for verified resources in the pinned description, a vetted elder safety guide, and the official fundraising page that maintained transparent accounting for immediate needs. Share this story with someone who might need to know, an elder in your life, a neighbor who keeps a building going, a friend who works nights. Let attention turn into care. And when you pass a janitor next time, maybe nod, maybe say thanks. The world is held together, quietly and steadily, by hands that expect little. Seeing them is one small thing we can all afford to do.